Hello and welcome to Board Gamecast. My name is Jesper Edmark, also known as Mordecai on Board Game Geek, and I am the host of this show in which I show you full sessions of board games. This episode I will give you a 4-player game of Caylus. Caylus is one of my absolute favorite games and is by many considered one of the granddaddies of worker placement games. It is somewhat heavy for Euro, at least many people seem to think so. I am not sure I agree that much, but that is the general opinion of it. And I think that might have to do something with the fact that there are no random elements in the game except for the initial setup. So you play your opponents, and without any hidden information there can be analysis paralysis throughout the game when you're considering what is the best move for this particular situation. That is, of course, very dependent on the group you play in. Caylus is Ystad's most famous release, at least I think so, and while last week I showed you their first release, this is their best release in my opinion. The author of this game is William Attia, and in my honest opinion, I think he has created a masterpiece with this game. This is one of the games I have ranked as a 10 on Board Game Geek, and that is not likely to change anytime soon. Unfortunately, I don't get it out on the table as much as I want to, but that is probably due to the fact that many people do consider it a quite heavy game for being a light strategy game. I will start here with a short presentation and then I will get into gameplay, but I want to note that this is the finals of the Caylus tournament at GotCon 2012, and this is a tournament that I was the organizer of. Unfortunately, we did not have that many participants, but it still proved to be quite a good game. The French king has decreed that a castle shall be built in a small town of Caylus. As master builders, the players try to be the one master builder who has gained the most prestige with the king once the castle is complete. At the start of the game, Caylus is far too small of a town to supply the castle with building materials, so to be able to get the necessary resources for the castle, the infrastructure of the town must be enhanced. This serves as a second revenue of prestige for the players, as the buildings provide prestige both when built and when the opposing players decide to utilize them. The king also gives out favors each round to players who have impressed him by building the most on the castle and or jousted. Favors serve either as a third revenue of prestige or as one-time bonuses of money, resources or building actions. Central in Caylus is the road that winds down from the castle building site. On this road lies all the buildings that can be utilized by the player's workers. Each player have 6 workers, which they send out onto the board to collect resources or give other benefits. But the king's provost is a greedy man, and if bribed enough, he can prevent the workers from doing the work they have been paid to do, since he will not allow any worker that is further away from the castle than he is to work. Over the course of the game, the town will grow and provide more and better options as the players build buildings onto the road. At the start, only wooden buildings can be built, but once the mason gets into play, the powerful stone buildings become available. The lawyer gives the players the option of refitting buildings into residences, providing them with a larger income as well as the possibility to build the powerful but expensive prestige buildings with the help of an architect. However, the time to finish the castle is limited. The king's bailiff will move down the road at the end of each turn, and each time he reaches a transition point, the king will come and inspect the state of the castle. Players who have been diligent in building on the castle will receive more favors, while players who have neglected the castle will suffer a prestige penalty. The player who has read the intentions of their opponents correctly and acted accordingly will have gained the most prestige at the end of the game and thus won it. At the start of the game, the options for the players are very limited. Each player starts with 2 food and 1 wood, which is enough to build a wooden building, and it's 2/3 of the parts needed to build on the castle. But there are very few open spots, very few buildings to choose from in the beginning. So the first couple of turns usually are pretty quick. What is usually happening in the first rounds of the game is that people are vying for position. While position in turn order is very important, the first one into the castle usually gain a benefit over the other players simply because they have guaranteed themselves not to get any minus points from the castle at the king's inspection, but also because they do not feel as much pressure to go into the castle later turns. On the other hand, you usually want to have 2 sets of pieces in the castle in the first 6 spots, because then you gain an extra favor at the king's inspection phase. So that is something that you have to consider. Do I want to go in and gain an extra favor early? Usually the first one into the castle gains a favor, since no one else will be able to build 2. But at the same time, you might want to get 2 favors for that. If you manage to be the only one to build 2 pieces of the castle, for instance, in a turn or round, you will gain 1 favor because you built the most in the castle, and then you are guaranteed another favor at the king's inspection. So you really have to balance those 2 aspects. At the same time, being first to get buildings onto the road usually yields a lot of prestige, simply because those buildings will be available over the course of the game for longer, and that means more opportunities for the opponents to put their workers into your building, thus gaining you prestige. Since you gain 1 prestige every time another player assigns a worker to your building. Observe that they don't necessarily need to gain the effect from that building. The provost might end up closer to the castle than that building, thus negating the effect of the worker in that building, but you still gain the prestige simply because another player wanted to use your building. So in the first round here, you see very little action. You gain a few money grabbing actions, you gain position in the castle, and you try to get diversity in goods, so you are able to get into that castle and build on it. What Jim did here was that he decided to bribe the provost 1 step further along the road, and he did that because he wanted a shorter first phase, first part of the game, to give the other players less chance of gaining materials to build a lot in the castle, but also because he wanted to be able to start utilizing his own building. He was the first going into the road here with a merchant, so he wanted to make other people start using it as soon as possible. And that is another aspect of the game where you have to think about, what is my intentions here? Do I want to rush the game so it is a shorter game, thus denying the opponents the opportunities to build the prestige buildings, for instance? A short game usually have a lot less prestige buildings than a longer game, if for no other reason than gold being in limited supply. Also, if you rush the game, there will be a more abundant resource situation, because the better resource buildings will come into effect sooner. On the other hand, you will have less actions to spend on those buildings, so that is something to think about. Third round, and we have a competition for the castle. This is the first round in the game where someone has placed a worker onto the castle space. Blue here, she decided to put a worker on the castle after black, simply because she saw an opportunity to be the one who had built the most on the castle. But what ended up happen here is that the black player had used the office, sheriff's office building to affect the provost placement, and he moved the provost forward, which meant that he had some leeway as to where the provost would end up. At the same time, he has quite desperate situation if he does not get the resources he had in mind here. If the other players band together and move the provost back, then blue player will definitely steal the castle from him, and that will give him less of a benefit from going to the castle here, since he has the two workers that is furthest away from the castle. He runs the risk of that happening. Then again, he has mitigated that risk by passing last, which means that he will be the last one to bribe the provost. So if the provost had moved back so far that he would not get his own buildings, he can just continue moving it back and denying the other players of their resources. So he felt pretty safe here. Blue, on the other hand, had placed on one of the carpenters, so she had an opportunity to spend resources not only in the castle but also by building a building here. So she had the opportunity to do both. And what ended up happening was that both black player and blue player decided to build two houses to make sure that they got both the points and the extra favor at the king's inspection phase. And since the provost was moved away from the castle, the bailiff again moved 2 steps forward on the road, which meant that the next round would definitely be the last round for the first phase of the game. So with that in mind, orange player here just went first into the castle to make sure that he got at least one part of the castle built, so he would not gain any negative prestige in the king's inspection phase. Something to note here is that if you are at 0 prestige at the king's inspection phase, you cannot go below 0. But then again, you are probably in a quite desperate situation if that is the case. Something that is important when you play this game is that turn order is static, and it will only change when players pay the workers to go to the stable, which is the 5th building on the road, the 2nd building before the bridge. And that space has 3 spots for workers, so 3 workers can go there. The first one into the stable will be the first player next round. The second will be second, and the third one will go third. Usually not all 3 spots will be used up. You most often only see 1 or 2 players placed there. The other players will just drop down in the same order. They will retain the order that they had. So if you want to go earlier, you have to place on the stable. The turn order will not automatically make you first player in a round unless you spend actions and in effect money to gain that position. Speaking about the road here, buildings are always activated in order, and that's starting with a gate and moving down the road. Since jousting, which is the fourth building, costs 1 coin and a cloth to activate, this means that unless you have a cloth at the start of the turn or round, you simply won't be able to joust. You can still block the space for another player by paying your worker to go there, but you will not be able to activate it. And that is true because since they are activated in order, even if you have put a worker on a building that provides you with cloth, that will always be activated after the jousting spot has been activated. And so you need to have saved up a cloth from the round before to be able to utilize that building. And you gain 2 coins in the income phase, and that is the basic income. For each residence you gain 1 more coin, but 2 coins is the basic income. And you really do not want to start a round with 2 coins, because then you will be able to put 2 workers out on the board, and unless you take money with at least one of those actions, you will be in big trouble. And if the other players think that you are a threat, they can easily decide to take away those actions from you, and then you have really put yourself in a bad position. At the first King's Inspection phase here, we saw that that black player class, he used his bonus favor there to go to the second spot on the builder favor track, and that allows him to build a wooden building, so he gains a build action without actually putting a worker on a carpenter in this case. And he gets another bonus as well. He does not have to pay the wood for it, and that is the same for the further actions along that track. You can build stone buildings without the stone, you can build the residences without paying the coin, so you only need a cloth for it. But the last spot there is just an architect action. It's enough powerful as it is, so you don't gain an extra effect there. Speaking of the favors, there are some limitations as how much you can go up in the favor tracks, depending on which phase it is of the game. The first phase, you cannot pass the 2 first spots on a track, and that is shown by the little thicker line there between the second column and the third column. So you can stay and you can build several wooden buildings, or you can take 4 money several times, or you can stay on the same spot and take 2 prestige points several times, but you cannot move past that. All the favors work as such that you move up 1 space or you stand still, and then you can take any of the favors on that space or lower. So for the resource track, when you move to the 3rd spot there, you can in effect take any of the 4 basic resources. You do not have to take a cloth just because you moved to the 3rd spot in the favor track. What happened here in the transitions phase as well was that Jim, the red player, he was shut out of the first part of the castle. So you can start building on a next phase section, but that section will not count towards the parts you have built when the king comes to inspect. But if you put a worker into the castle area and then decide not to work, you suffer a prestige penalty. Because you have basically said to the king, I'm gonna build on your castle, and then you don't, and then he gets a bit angry. So he decided to build one part of the next step on the castle, just not to get that penalty. As you see here, we have a lot of buildings from black, blue and red. The orange player has decided not to go into buildings, and that is something that he said to me after the game, that he had decided to try to avoid building buildings and have the other players compete for those actions. Another interesting note here is that the mason, which is the wooden building that allows you to build stone buildings, it came out quite early, which should in theory make the builder track less powerful. But that is of course only true if people actually start using the mason. And so far we have seen no player use the mason. And there have been situations where they could have done so. Stone is out on the board and has been in the players' stockpiles, but for some reason they decided to use them elsewhere. And that is one thing with this game: you want to do a lot and you do not have enough actions to do it all, and all players compete for the same actions, so you have to prioritize which actions you think are the best for you and which actions are better for the opponents, or to hinder the opponents to get. At this point in time we see orange player really pumping the prestige point track here and trying to get as many prestige point actions in as possible. And for that work you need a lot of cloth. You need to be able to be the first one to put into jousting. You likely want to build on the castle as few houses as possible, but several times be the one who builds the most. That is an interesting equation. If you can manage to do that, then get favors from the castle a lot of time and jousting a lot, you can definitely win by doing this course of action here. The stone buildings with 3 resources as an activation ability also gains the owner of that building 1 resource of the 2 different choice of the resources. There's always 2 different resources and the owner gets 1 of those. And when the opponent places on that building, that is, and those are the most powerful buildings in the game, in my opinion. Depending on the type of game, of course, but usually they are a clear indicator of who is winning the game. If the same player gets all 3 of those out, then the other players are playing a chasing game where they really have to try and stop the stone builder to run away with the win. And the black player here, Klaus, has 2 of those buildings at this point in time. So he's getting close to that stage where he will be chased by all the other players. The cost of building a building is shown in the upper left corner of the tile, and true for all resource icons is that a white cube is any cube. If there is a white cube, you can exchange any type of cube, including gold, for that cube. So several of the buildings have wood and, for instance, 1 cube of your choice. That is something to think about. So you And that is true at the castle as well. You can spend gold to build castle parts. But since gold is worth 3 points at the end of the game, that is definitely a costly move. So far, this game has been really friendly. There has not been any building or work that has come home empty-handed because the provost has not allowed them to work. The provost has been moved forward a lot here, and that was part of Red's strategy to try and deprive other players of those big buildings, and that is, as I said earlier, that's a strategy that definitely can work, especially if you catch the others by surprise. Unfortunately, a Red player here was the player that paid the price for it in this game, because his time was a bit off, unfortunately. The bailiff and provost always start around on the same space. The provost, at the end of each round, the provost is moved to the new bailiff space, and that is entirely controlled by the players. The provost is bribed back and forth, and depending on where the provost ends up, that will define the exact movements of the bailiff. The bailiff will always move 1 or 2 spaces further down the road. He will move 2 spaces if the provost is further along the road than the bailiff is, and if the provost is standing on the same space or closer to the castle, in effect if he has been not bribed at all or bribed backwards to hinder the players to get effects of buildings, then he will only move 1 space. So in a friendly game like this, it is certainly a shorter game, because the bailiff will just run down the road 2 spaces each round almost. So that is something to think about. If the players try to stop the other players from gaining resources, then it will be a more stingy game, and it will go a little bit slower. If the players push the provost forward as much as possible, then the game will be shorter. Not only because the players will gain more resources, but also because the bailiff will go down the road faster. On the topic of bribing the provost, passing early means you have less control over where it ends, since you bribe the provost in order from the one that has passed first to the one that has passed last. So passing early means less control, but it's not entirely without benefit, because the first one who passes will gain a coin from the bank. Also, he or she will make it more expensive for the other players to put out workers on the board. For each player that has passed, the other players have to pay 1 more coin in salary to the workers to put them out on the board, unless you put them on a building that you have built yourself. In that case, you will always only pay 1 coin, and if you have the inn, which is the 6th building from the castle, you also only pay 1 coin no matter how many people have passed. That comes at expense of you having 1 less worker, and that worker can be pushed out by the other players if they so desire by placing in the inn, and then the new worker will take the place of the old one the next turn. I'd like to say something about resources and resource management. The game is divided into 3 segments, as well as the castle, and the cost to build on the castle is the same throughout the game. Of course, spending resources early in the game has a higher opportunity cost, since it's harder to come by resources early than late, and that is one reason for the castle yielding more points early in the game than later in the game. But still, the castle in itself doesn't give long-term benefits, and it's more expensive to build segments of the castle than it is to build buildings. Buildings give you almost the same amount of prestige just when you put them out on the board, but they also give you a long-term benefit in form of prestige over the course of the game when the opponents put their workers on your building. So why would you want to build on the castle? Well, the reason is quite simple actually. It is for favors. The one who builds most in the castle gains a favor each round, as well as you gain favors in the king's inspection phase if you have built in the castle. If you have neglected to build in the castle, you also get minus points or negative prestige points in that phase, which means that is also a reason to build in the castle. But that is something you have to balance, buildings and castle building. Unfortunately, this game, 2 cloth had been mixed in with black's pieces, and that is something that really screwed up the game. Why it happened, I don't know. I had set up everything except for the bags of pieces, so the players who had played this game before must have mixed it in by mistake. And I know that black player here did not intend to cheat, definitely not, but it was something that definitely screwed up the game, honestly. I think that it actually decided the game in the end. Those 2 cloth became such an important part of the last stages of the game. And I take some of the blame here because I was the organizer of this, and I could have taken a decision that, those have not been seen by other players this round. You had to discard them even if you collected them yourself, which black player and all the other players all thought that he had done. No one thought that they had been there from the beginning, that he had not taken them. They all thought that he had just collected them and managed to mix them in with his houses. It's really unfortunate, and that is something to realize here, that black and in this edition the cloth cubes are very similar in color, and unless you do like the red player has done here and put your houses and discs in an orderly fashion, he's the only one of the 4 that has done that, there is a risk of you mixing in the cloth cubes into the black houses, and that is unfortunately something that can happen. But I want you to pay attention to that when you play the game, that if you have this edition of the game, make sure that that doesn't happen to you. But back to the game. The favors are an integral part, as I said, and usually a player who has managed to gain many favors throughout the game will also be in competition for the victory. Meanwhile, players who have gotten very few favors most likely will not be able to win the game. And that is because favors do give you so much benefit. It's only one-time benefits, but it's usually bonus actions in effect. You gain you gain points or money or building actions that you would simply not get otherwise, and you don't have to pay extra for them unless you build extra spots on the castle just to steal the favor from someone else. But it's you can gain so much from the favors that you really do not want to neglect them at all. That said, the favors are very much dependent on the particular session, and what favor tracks as well the players have gone for. For instance, the builder track is generally very powerful, the most powerful in my opinion, but if the mason and or the lawyer are built early, the builder track loses much in strength. The same goes for the money and resource tracks. The resource tracks is usually the weakest, but if it is a game where very few resource buildings come into play, then you can definitely have a lot of benefit from it. And it's the same with the money track. If it's a game where the money is scarce, when people have
decided to destroy the money-yielding buildings and not build the market that gives you more money, and people have bribed a lot, then taking the money track is a great benefit. But if it's a game where people have been very friendly to each other, not much bribing has been done, and the markets have been out for most of the game, then the money track loses in value, definitely. The prestige track is very hard to use. It's depending on the session. Again, you can gain a lot of points from it. I spoke about it briefly earlier here, but it doesn't give you any long-term benefits in the game, and you usually have more benefit from the other tracks. But then again, you can gain a lot of points if you are alone in pumping a lot of favors. If you are granted a lot of favors throughout the game, that track alone can more or less win it for you. So it's definitely not a track that you want to just ignore. But for the first times you play this game, you will find that the prestige track is usually not going to win you the game. It might be good to use some of them later in the game, some favors there, but other than that, basing your whole strategy on that track will usually not end up well when you play the game for the first time. At the end of the game here, it might seem that there is a lot of rounds left, but in actuality that is not the case. The players have a lot of resources at this stage in the game, so you can, for that reason, see that it will probably end quite soon. If the provost is moved forward as well, then there will only be a maximum of 2 rounds left. If he's moved forward both of those rounds, because that will mean that the bailiff will take 2 steps each turn, and that will end the game as well. But a lot of resources means that a lot of part of the castle will be built, and at this point in time there are only 11 spaces left of the castle, and once those are built, the game is over. So simply because there are so many resource buildings out in play here, the game is likely to end very soon here. Something I haven't spoken about and that the players have not used in this game is the gate, the first building along the road. And that is a very situational building. I want to mention it because it is also one of those buildings that are debated if it's worth to use or not. I personally like it very much, because if you have a lot of resources and you know that after this round I will have the most resources, I will be able to build most on the castle. Instead of putting on a castle, you can put on a gate. And the effect that will have is that you will bully the other players not to go to the castle. Usually you want to build on the castle only when you can get a favor or when the spots are running out. So that is something that you can use to bully other players. If you know that you will have the most resources, build the most in the castle, you can put on a gate and then wait for other players. If they go to the castle, you go to the castle behind them, and then you just build more than they do, and that will give you the favor instead. And if they don't go to the castle, you just go there anyway, and you only build one part, and then you have almost all your resources left for the next round. And unless something crazy happens there when the other players gain a lot of resources more than you do, then you will be in a good shape of getting the favor that turn around as well. So that is some one way you can use the gate, and I like to do that if possible. You can also use it in combination with the sheriff's office. If there are lucrative buildings further down the road that you really want to use, but you think that if I put the worker there, someone will take the sheriff and bribe it backwards, or the other players will work together to bribe it backwards. You can put on the sheriff and then the gate, and if the other players decide to utilize the workers on the lucrative buildings, you simply use the sheriff to move it backwards and have the other players pay more money to gain the effect. And if they do not go to those buildings, you move your gate worker to one of those buildings and you gain the effect, because that is what the gate does. It delays the worker placement. When the gate is activated, the worker on the gate is moved to any free spot on the board. So you cannot do the same action as someone else, but you still move it to a beneficial action. And it's hard to use, but it can be used as a bullying move, really. So we have the last round of the game here, and there's only 3 spots in the castle. There won't be any more rounds than this, unless something strange happens where it's only one player that goes to the castle and decides not to build out. Also, the provost must move, stay in put, or be moved towards the castle and not away from it. But that could happen, but it's not likely to happen. And at this point in time, we see that the orange player has gained a lot of prestige from the prestige track, and as well as has gotten a lot of prestige just from favors from the castle. And he will be the last one to get the favor in the last round here as well, so that will also yield him a lot of points. At the same time, black player here is the only player that is able to build a prestige building if the game ends this turn. And that is simply because no other player has a residence in play. And without residences, you can't build prestige buildings, since you have to replace a residence with your prestige building. So that is something to think about as well. Blue player here, she wanted to delay the game if possible, to be able to get the prestige building out, or simply getting more turns. Unfortunately, since the lawyer is not built here, she would never get to a position where she would be able to build the prestige building. In this situation, the only one that would have the possibility to build another prestige building is black player class. He already has a residence, and if it drags out another turn, he could manage to build another residence and then use a favor to build a second prestige building. But the players here are realizing that this is most likely the last turn, and they scramble to get the most points out of the situation. The building spots the mason, and well, there's only one carpenter left here because the first one was replaced by residence. Usually ends up being taken the last turns or turn of the game, simply because the buildings give points between 2 and 6 points. And other than that, the gold is collected for points, if not for prestige buildings. You also gain bonus points at the end for the amount of resources you have left and money you have left. Each 4 coins give you a prestige point, and each 3 basic resources give you another prestige point. So your leftover goods and money doesn't go to waste, but they are usually better spent if you convert them into points in other ways, like building or spending your money for something else. There are a building that's the church that allows you to convert money into prestige points. There's also a building that allows you to convert money into gold, effectively making them into prestige points, or giving you a way to build those prestige buildings in the end. That was the first time in the game that building was not activated due to the provost not allowing the worker to give its effect. So the last round of the game, that says quite a lot about the type of session this was. It was a very friendly session in that respect. Usually in my group there are a lot of bribing backwards. So if you take the lucrative buildings, you always take a gamble. You most likely will not gain the effect. But that is my group, and this is certainly a game where groupthink comes into play, since there are no random elements in the game. There are only the other players to consider. So the last King's Inspection phase, and one thing that is interesting here is that there is a reason to put on stable the last turn, because the King's Inspection is always done in turn order. So if there are few buildings of a certain type left, for instance, or if you are competing for the same prestige building, then you can gain a benefit from going before the other players, simply because you have a better choice of buildings. And but one thing that is also important here is that if you gain several favors, you cannot at the same time, you cannot put them on the same track. So if I gain 2 or 3 favors, which is common in the King's Inspection phases, you cannot take the same track more than once. So I can take one in one of the favors on the prestige track, and then I can take one on the building track, but I cannot take 2 favors on the prestige track at the same time. And that is quite important. That means, especially since some of the prestige buildings give you extra favors. So that is one reason why it's very important to try and set up for the last turn in that respect. So we ended the game here, and at the end Klaus here won with 10 points over Rickard, and then Jim and Erika had quite a battle, a few points back from there. The 2 extra cloth for black here probably decided the game. 10 points might seem like a lot, but that is it's not that much, especially since one of the cloth was used to block Orange from taking a joust action that he was guaranteed to get, because no one else had cloth at that time. So that is 5 points basically in itself. So that is very unfortunate, and I have to apologize to the players here for not spotting it earlier. I was not present and observing the game throughout the entire game here. Due to it being a convention, I had other things to tend to as well. But that is no excuse. I should have checked that nothing like this could happen. But the game is as it is. It's really good game. One of my absolute favorites, as I said. I hope you enjoyed the session in spite of that mistake, and I hope you got interested in it, and I can really recommend it. Yes, it's a bit on the heavier side, but I do not agree with people saying it's too heavy to be a Eurogame, a light strategy game. That is not my opinion at all. And if you suggest that we play Kalos to me, and I will definitely say yes anytime, as long as I have the time. But I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope that you will come back and watch the next one. And until then, I bid you farewell. Bye bye.